As we all know, Disney has used some indigenous characters in their films, and as proposition side in this debate, we regret this act. And as the first speaker, I am going to tell you why. I will give you two arguments in favor of our side about about cultural property rights and some inaccuracy in representation. So our first argument, Disney takes away one's cultural property. They are taking away the sacred cultural property of certain tribes and countries and changing it to create characters so that their films are like to meet up with filmmaking needs. And this is like it's they're using this culture as their own trademark sort of, and it's taking away their right to their uh, own cultural property. So on to our next argument about inaccuracy of presentation. So in Disney films, these indigenous characters are usually represented in an inaccurate way. It might give people a wrong impression of these peoples, whether that impression is good or bad. It negatively impacts the indigenous people since they are the ones being wrongly or inaccurately represented. This will cause some racism and cultural stereotypes. Movies greatly affect how people look at things. If these movies continue to characterize these indigenous peoples, more and more cultures would be wrongly represented, and the audience of these movies will have an inaccurate impression of these people. So, to give a few examples of Disney wrongly representing some indigenous peoples, in Peter Pan, the Indians are wrongly represented to be savage and exotic. There are also some racist elements in Disney films, such as in the musical's name, What Makes a Red Man Red, in the film. Uh, so we regret Disney using these indigenous peoples and their characters in films. This will, like, if you want to acknowledge people of indigenous peoples, right, then you could have like maybe BBC make some films like real life films with scientific evidence to back these up about these indigenous people. It don't like use a movie to characterize these people because movies will uh, warp how these indigenous people should be like. That is all for my speech. Thank you. We are proud to.
We, the opposition house, strongly oppose the fact that Disney should regret its use of indigenous characters. Before I begin with my substantive arguments, I would like to present some flaws in the opposition's arguments. Their first argument was about cultural property rights, and they talked about taking away the indigenous culture. However, it's more like preserving it. Disney doesn't drastically change the indigenous culture just for content or filmmaking needs. These films are required to cross-check with reliable sources. In this context, those reliable sources would be indigenous people. They wouldn't willingly bend or twist history just so they can make a few extra dollars off the movie. Their second argument was about inaccuracies. However, inaccuracies are incredibly rare, and Disney will always do their research. Even if there are inaccuracies, the film is still well thought out and with good intentions. We shouldn't regret an entire film just for a small mistake. Humans make mistakes. Don't regret a massive feat or movie just because of a mistake. Now onto my substantive arguments. My first argument is about how this promotes diversity. No matter what the critics say, including indigenous people in films is an attempt at promoting diversity. Regardless of whether it succeeds or not or how successful it is always a careful, thought-out attempt at including indigenous people more. There have been many campaigns to do this. These campaigns call for more indigenous actors and voice actors. While there are less indigenous actors than non-indigenous actors, Disney films are mostly animated films, so there can be an unlimited amount of indigenous characters without the restraint of finding actors. Disney films, including indigenous actors, are a great way to promote diversity because of its publicity. The very reason why this will promote diversity is because it is so public and so many people will view it and see that indigenous people are being included. In our eyes, there is no harm in including indigenous people in films other than a few critics. And existing films that include indigenous people have been widely accepted and praised among the indigenous community. These films probably won't even offend the people that it was supposed to offend. My second argument is that it helps to preserve the culture of indigenous people. While some indigenous groups are greatly recognized and have their culture greatly preserved, many aren't so lucky. With many indigenous people around the world dwindling in population, their culture is slowly forgotten, and the remaining people often forget about their culture and just become like the rest of society. However, due to the immense publicity of such films, it can help to preserve the culture by displaying the customs and traditions. This also adds on to the education point my second speaker will talk about. The mechanisms and logic for this are clear. For example, Disney releases a particular film involving a certain indigenous culture and showcases it in a cheerful and positive atmosphere. Since Disney is popular and the film gains publicity, the culture as well gains more recognition and is preserved. People of that culture realize that Disney is in support of them and the culture is preserved. And even if it isn't long-term, it can still preserve it greatly and make a significant impact. This is why we believe that our side of the house has the upper hand in this debate.
So, as proposition second speaker, I will talk about why we regret Disney's use of their characters and settings in their films. All right. So first, I'm going to refute our opponent's opinions, and then further rebuild on my teammates' points. So first, they have said that they will promote diversity and help to preserve culture. Well, I do not think this is true, as actually they've done an extremely bad job of promoting diversity and probably even offended multiple people. Well, I have one example. The lack of minority representation, the usage of racial stereotypes in Disney movies negatively impacts children of the color or other minority groups and tribes. And looking at the vast vault of Disney films, it's easy to notice that characters of color um, are are only a small part and painfully absent. And second, I'm going to refute the point that they say it helps to preserve culture. But however, I do not think this is true. First of all, they are not a culture institute, and then they are just taking away their culture for them to earn profit. As as using these characters are actually probably the same as taking some characters from other authors. However, they do not have to pay royalty and other things. And we think that they have actually changed a lot of things in their so-called preserving culture. As for example, as my teammate has says, the Indians represented in Peter Pan. They are actually not like that. And because they have to make a story, they're always a bad guy and a good guy. Probably the indigenous characters represented are actually not bad in real life, but they just have to write the story. And that's why we think they're not preserving culture, as they're warping the truth. And now I'm going to further elaborate on my teammate's point. First of all, she has said that about inaccuracy causes racism and cultural stereotypes. Because to write a story, they must have like a plot. Although it doesn't really happen in history, they still need a plot. And this might give people a wrong impression of these characters, whether the impression is good or bad, and it negatively impacts the indigenous people since they are wrongly presented to the world. This will cause racism and cultural stereotypes, and movies greatly affect how people look at things. Like, if we look at the jails in movies, you will believe that that is true, but actually it's not. And these people are wrongly presented to the world. If these movies continue to characterize these people, more and more cultures will be wrongly represented and understood, and the watchers of the movie will have an inaccurate representation of these tribes and people. Well, second, I'm going to further elaborate on how Disney takes away their sacred cultural property. Well, they're just a company, not a cultural institution. They are just a company, as I said. Their purpose to make profits by creating characters, making movies, selling merchandise, even opening amusement parks. When they use characters and backgrounds of other ethnic groups to create stories, it's no different from recreating the works of other writers. These characters are even more famous. However, they do not get consent and pay royalties. When they recreate these characters, the copyright of these characters even belong to Disney. And this is a blatant cultural plagiarism because these characters are used to tell an animated story. No matter how it's my protective time, sorry. No matter how expressed, cultural, it will be accompanied by many problems, such as gender bias and cultural stereotypes. Because of these reasons, we are proud to propose. Thank you.
Okay, so in this speech, I'll do three things. First, I'll point out major flaws in the opposition's argument. Second, I'll present pieces of substantive. And third, I'll explain why each piece of substantive is both true and important. So before I begin my substantive, I would like to point out several flaws in the opposition's arguments. So firstly, they would have us believe that Disney takes away the rights to the cultural property of indigenous groups. They claim that when a movie is made about them, they are represented inaccurately, which negatively impacts these said people. They say that they characterize these characters to make them more likable, thus making Disney more money. However, our side of the house believes that when this happens, if it even does, yes, it may cause some false ideas about these individuals. However, this is rare, and Disney really wants to make money, they wouldn't show that they don't pay attention to the indigenous group they're talking about. This combined with the fact that the more popular the movie is, the wider the audience it reaches, and thus it means that more action is generated for these groups. And by reaching a wider range of audiences, it means that more people will care and advocate for these rights. So now onto my substantive. My first point is about how allowing these movies to show people the problems these indigenous peoples may be facing, such as cultural assimilation, is good. Movies have the power to reach a very wide audience and can be used as an effective means to reach people. By including these indigenous characters in movies, people will be able to see the struggles these people face. Furthermore, Disney movies are mostly targeted at children who are the future generation, and it allows them to grow up with a mindset that we need to help these indigenous cultures and lift them out of their problems. So by placing these characters into movies, it helps to make it so that the problems feel much closer to the individual in a sense. So in many movies in previous generations, these indigenous groups were very wrongfully portrayed as savages, which the proposition agrees. And this is detrimental to reaching what should be our goal of diversity. So the proposition's main point is that in these movies, sometimes these cultural groups are appropriated and represented inaccurately. However, our side of the house believes that although these problems are unfortunate, which we concede, the benefits of our status quo far outweigh this. Consider the difference between a world where cultures are recognized and celebrated with occasional errors in the history or culture, or a world where these cultures are assimilated and damaged to the point where very few are educated about it. Clearly, we can see the first option is superior. It's of vital importance that we reach a wide audience about problems that these people are facing, because these indigenous groups are in most cases a disadvantaged minority. Yes?
But creating movies is not the only way to acknowledge the people of these indigenous tribes.
Yes, but that's not the topic of this debate. We're merely saying that these movies help these movies help these indigenous groups, but they're not the only form. However, we're saying that these movies help. We're not saying that it is the only form. So as I was saying, when a greater audience is reached, it means that we can increase the overall understanding and empathy that felt towards the indigenous communities. This breaks down social stereotypes and misconceptions, which are commonly attributed towards these indigenous groups. My second point is that when creating these movies, it helps to educate them about these cultures. So the opposition may claim that in doing so, that these mistakes become part of the way the audience portrays them. However, these mistakes are few and far between, and lots of research has been put into making it as accurate as possible. The fact also said that the main purpose of these films is to generate action and empathy for these groups, not to create a perfect fact file about these indigenous groups. If it was, it might as well be a documentary, which doesn't generate the raw emotion we need to push and advocate for this action. This is of vital importance as advocating for action to support indigenous communities is one of the major factors in which we can progress and create a diverse society. So first and foremost, indigenous communities have historically been marginalized and oppressed in many parts of the world and continue to face significant challenges in terms of access to basic resources such as healthcare, education, and clean water. So by advocating for basic action to support these communities, we can help to address these challenges and work towards a more just and equitable society. So overall, when comparing our status quo to the model, to the opposition's model, it is clear the status quo is superior. Thus, I believe it is clear that our side of the House has the upper hand in this debate.
So
Thank you.
This House would believe that that the Disney using these characters are not a good are can cause segregation and then leave some very, it can also leave racism and cultural stereotypes. First of all, I'm gonna say that actually the culture you're saying that all is that the ones that come from places like Oceania, Asia, Africa, places actually not even you're not talking about the cultures in Europe. Actually, because it is a European world, they are actually ruining these cultures. Like culturing these folk tales and cultures. For example, in a very near Disney movie, they use Snow White. They use a Latin America's actor to play Snow White. This is like just not even thinking about the original story. And because that they have to be converted to a movie, many of these original morals will be ruined. And then also because that Disney, even so that they actually include some of these, so they actually include some of these Princess and the Frog, the only black princess of Disney, the Princess Tina. For 4 3/4 of the film, she is a frog, and it is symbolizing Disney's reluctance to dissipate a black princess. And it's the only African American character in the movie who remains human in the movie is a villain. And
Point of information.
What? Okay. I'm pretty sure it's not over a minute.
It has been over a minute.
Okay.
You accept the point of information?
Yes.
Okay, so you talked about how in the movie there's a movie where a black princess is a frog for half of the screen time. However, have you in your house considered that this might be part of the story itself and not because of racial discrimination?
Because that it has cultural words. If it's going to be because that the story, they can write the story for another way. Like in the original, the Princess and the Frog, like the princess stays person the most time, but in this movie they actually change it because they have this thinking that this is like this. And then also I want to then now restate my opponents, no, my teammates' views. For example, they would think that, for example, like this would cause racism and cause stereotypes because these people they don't know like a lot of these cultures. They only know a bit, so that they can use, so they might give people a wrong impression of these people whenever the person is good or bad. And this is really bad for the indigenous people because that if the movie there's all like one kind of people as a villain, they all think that these kind of people they are villains. and then it's Disney takes, and the second one is Disney will take someone else's cultural properties and use it as their own icons, and so that the people can use some of the stories like the characters born like that because the Disney took it first. And then also I want to talk about it is like talk about that if you want to use culture, and if you want culture, then you can get it in, like, you can make these documentaries, and because as you make you can put them in documentaries, or you can let the people of their own country to talk about this thing, not let somebody from another country do it, because that's and because that Disney, they are not, they can put their own American culture or European cultures, but they can't represent the Chinese culture or the South or India cultures, and also Disney and also let me see this and 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 the Little Miss, and then and people, and because Disney's their audience is very young, giving them a type of a stereotype will lead them with their own life. And from all the above, actually using these financial compromise is not a good idea, because it will leave bad instincts to the young people. And if you really wanted to show culture, you can let the people from their own country show their
Good
own
evening,
culture.
adjudicator and fellow debaters. As the third speaker of the opposition, I will provide refutation for the government arguments and a summary of my team's points. Let me begin with my rebuttal. The government's first speaker stated that Disney takes away cultural property rights. This is completely not true, because think of the alternatives. If you don't want to be unfair to the indigenous actors, you put no indigenous characters or actors at all. This, in fact, is a lot worse than having indigenous actors, as we are completely ignoring them and leaving them out in their possible scenario. In comparison, the status quo is completely fine as it is, because they are exaggerating the small mistakes and inaccuracies to expand them to way more than they actually are. So therefore, it's actually more like preserving property rights, not removing them. Next, they don't change it for content or filmmaking needs, because Disney films are known for cross-checking with reliable sources, and in this context, all of the indigenous peoples or other sources on the internet. Therefore, mistakes are really rare. Their second point was about inaccuracies about the culture. As I have stated before, inaccuracies are really rare, and Disney will always do their research. Because even if there are inaccuracies, rarely, it is still well thought out and with good intentions, and probably doesn't accident. We shouldn't regret just an entire film just for a small mistake, because humans do make mistakes. So don't regret a massive feat or a movie just because of a mistake. Let me continue on with the government's second speaker. They stated that Disney steals cultures by using them in movies. Like, seriously, just talking about some culture in a movie does not mean you are stealing it. And simply including the culture doesn't instantly result in stealing something. As I've said before, the alternative is completely leaving the indigenous people out, which is like 10 times worse than adding them. Let me continue about the third speaker. They talked about segregation and discrimination, and which basically still continues on about the inaccuracies points. However, as I've said again and again before, the alternative is a lot worse. The POI offered by my second speaker also correctly showed a large flaw in the opposition, which is that most transformative content is simply just being original and for the story. Now let me go on to summarize my team's case. My team has stated a range of reasons. Number one, it promotes diversity in movies because it includes people of all cultures. Also, it can show the public problems that the indigenous people may be facing, and which also leads on to educating them about their culture and way of life. Next, our model helps to preserve the indigenous people's cultures for those facing assimilation, and it also promotes diversity again. And thus, I am proud I'm proud to negate.
Prime
Thank you.
Minister has stated that there may be inaccuracies and that it violates cultural property rights. However, this is well rebutted by the first opposition speaker, who correctly states that small mistakes shouldn't lead to the regret of an entire film. They then talked about preserving culture and diversity, which isn't well responded to by the government, who uses intuitive logic rather than concrete evidence. The Deputy Prime Minister simply restated many of the points of the Prime Minister, stating that Disney appropriates and unfairly takes away the property rights. However, as later opposition speakers pointed out, simply including a particular culture doesn't necessarily result in instantly stealing, and it is an exaggeration. The second opposition stated that the younger generation will grow up with the knowledge of indigenous people and will have more empathy for them. It also helps break free from stereotypes and improves the education and improves the general public's education of indigenous people. These points are not well rebutted by the government with solid evidence. The government whip tried to rebut by restating the previous speaker's rebuttal, introducing no new content. The POI offered by the second opposition correctly point out that perhaps some transformative content is simply an attempt at originality and story and isn't meant to be taken offensively. The response from the government whip is not clear. The opposition whip successfully rebutted a large proportion of the government's case, whipping previous speakers in the process. This whipping included the point about diversity and inclusion. Finally, there was an encapsulation of the already strong points posed by the opposition team. This is why the opposition house has won this debate.
So as proposition reply, I will first summarize a few clashes we had in the debate and then finally prove to you why our team is winning. So first of all, we had one central clash, which is about cultural property. And our opponents have said that they are actually not taking away the property, but however, trying to preserve it. But we have refuted that this doesn't work like that, as first, they are not preserving property when you are preserving something that has been modified a lot, as the story is completely not similar to history, and most of the time they're just using some people trying to make diversity and just putting them in random stories. And second, they have said that they are trying to promote diversity. However, we believe that is not true too, as we have provided evidence in all Disney films as people of color are actually very absent in this set of films. And finally, our opponents have said we have said that it actually causes the racism and the inaccuracy because they have to make a story to earn the profits. And this is why we think this is not true. And our opponents have said that we agree to our opponents that we haven't provided some evidence on how it actually preserves some of this does not preserve some of this culture. However, we have provided a lot of evidence on how it has been warped and how it is actually unethical as it takes away others' property. However, on the opposition side, you have not provided zero solid evidence, zero reference to any of the films that Disney has created. And that is why we think we're having the upper hand of using real evidence here. And so that is why we think our team is winning, as we are more realistic and using more solid evidence. And we think that they are actually not preserving culture, as in multiple mistakes that you have said in the Disney movies. And these are actually warping the realism of this film. And also, you are not preserving diversity and preserving culture, but causing racism and inaccuracy. And above all these reasons, we are proud to propose. Thank you.